The trachea is a semi-rigid tube that serves as a passageway for air through the mediastinum. The trachea is reinforced by rings of hyaline cartilage that are in the shape of the letter C. So these rings are sometimes referred to as the C rings, or simply more oftentimes referred to as tracheal rings. This image here shows you the trachea, at least anteriorly. It's a little difficult to see, but there's actually cartilage running through the wall of the trachea in this pattern that I'm outlining here. So you have these C-shaped rings once again to help reinforce the wall of the trachea. Posteriorly, there is no cartilage. At the posterior aspect of the trachea, you're going to see a muscle covered by basically mucous membrane. That area of the trachea is referred to as the trachealis membrane or trachealis muscle. Once again, no cartilage to reinforce. The reason that there is no cartilage here at the posterior aspect of the trachea is because the esophagus rests right behind the trachea. The esophagus is basically a flattened tube. When you swallow solid food, the esophagus expands in order to allow that food to continue to move through the esophagus. Well, if there was rigidity imparted to the trachea here due to the presence of cartilage, the esophagus would not be able to expand. Therefore, essentially, you would not be able to swallow. So, the lack of cartilage at the posterior aspect of the trachea allows for the slight expansion of the esophagus as food moves through. That's the reason why the cartilage rings do not continue to the posterior aspect of the trachea. As the trachea runs through the mediastinum, ultimately it will begin to branch at its inferior aspect. The branching point of the trachea is called the carina. The carina, once again, is the branch point. It is also the most sensitive area where a cough reflex can be initiated, because once you move into the extensions that are past the carina, you're going to ultimately be moving into the lungs. So if you want to prevent something from being able to enter the lungs, in other words, expel it before it gets there, you have to initiate the strongest and most intense cough reflex at the carina, because that's the last opportunity that you would have to stimulate that cough reflex before whatever that material would enter the lungs. So the trachea, once again, a semi-rigid tube reinforced by rings of hyaline cartilage called tracheal rings. These tracheal rings not seen posteriorly, because there you would have the trachealis membrane or trachealis muscle that will allow for expansion of the esophagus. At its inferior aspect, the trachea branches at the carina, and the carina is going to be the most sensitive area for a cough, or to trigger rather, a cough reflex.